Welcome to Medieval India. Episode 10. The Vijayanagar Empire. To the south of those Deccan sultanates, and covering the entire lower extremity of the subcontinent, except Kerala, a Hindu power, Vijayanagar, not just a worthy successor to the Chola Empire, but the greatest Hindu empire since the days of Harsha, held its own from the middle of the 14th century for more than 200 years. Muhammad Tughlaq had been a menace to the very existence of Hindu religion and civilization in the south, until his blind policy of aggression was checked by the successful rebellion of 1334 in Madurai, which converted that province into a disorganized Muslim kingdom. The third king to fight his way to the throne of Madurai in 1340 was Ghiyas-ud-Din Damghani, or Damghan Shah, who had served as a trooper in the Delhi army. Damghan Shah was a brutal tyrant who delighted in the wholesale massacre and torture of Hindu captives, men, women and children alike, and waged continuous war against Veera Ballala III, the last of the Hoysala kings, whose realm was the last remaining bulwark against the Muslim conquest of southern India. Veera Ballala was defeated by Damghan at the Battle of Tiruchinopoli in 1342, and the old man of 80 was taken prisoner. The Sultan first treated him with apparent consideration, until he had exacted from him his treasures, horses and elephants by promising to release him. When he had relieved him of all he had, he slew him and had him skinned. The skin was stuffed with straw and exhibited from the walls of Madurai. Veera Ballala's son appears also to have died in battle, but the spirit of the old king lived on in 5 brothers, Harihara and Bukka being the most important among them. Their dynasty was to be named after their father, Sangama. There is a long and acrimonious debate about the antecedents of those brothers among Indian historians. According to the Muslim chronicles, they fled from Warangal after its capture by the Muslims. They then settled at Kampili, a small realm close to what was to become the city of Vijayanagar, where they were taken prisoner by the Sultan's army in 1327. They were then taken to Delhi and converted to Islam, and the Sultan sent them back as lords of Kampili on his behalf. There they came under the influence of the Hindu ascetic Vidayaranya, who reconverted them to Hinduism. They soon headed a group of Hindu rebels against the Muslim rule and founded a new realm with as its capital the city of victory of Vijayanagar at a strategic place south of the Tungabhadra river, where Hariharan was crowned in 1336. It was probably also due to Vidayaranya's influence that the early rulers of Vijayanagar regarded themselves as the representatives of the god Virupaksha, to whom the main temple of Vijayanagar is dedicated. Later rulers even signed documents in the name of Virupaksha. After defeating the Hoysala king, whose power had been weakened by fighting both against Delhi and Madurai in 1346, Harihara held a great celebration in the ashram of Sringeri, the seat of the Sankaracharyas, or the followers of the 8th century saint Sankara. He thus also obtained the necessary ritual sanction for his coronation. While this dramatic story used to be accepted by most Indian and foreign historians, it is challenged by other historians, mostly from the state of Karnataka, and based upon the interpretation of very scant evidence from inscriptions. They claim that Harihara and Bukka were local warriors of Karnataka, whom the Hoysala king, Ballala III, had posted at the northern border of his realm to defend it against Muslim attacks. They also maintained that Harihara ascended the throne only in 1346, after the death of the last Hoysala king, Ballala IV. But this more plausible account of the local origins of the founders of Vijayanagar was rejected as mere wishful thinking of Karnataka's regional historians by the rest. Recent interpretations of inscriptions, which were not known to earlier historians, tend now, however, to support the theory that the founders of Vijayanagar were local princelings in the service of the Hoysala kings. These prove that the brothers were already dignitaries in the service of the Hoysala king a decade before their supposed flight to Kampili. One inscription of 1320 records that King Ballala III founded the town of Vijay Virupaksha Hoshapatana on the spot which was later to become Vijayanagar. After the death of Ballala IV, Ballala III's widow seems to have participated in the coronation of Harihara in 1346. In an inscription dated 1349, her name is mentioned before that of King Harihara, indicating that Harihara derived his legitimation from being an adopted heir of the Hoysalas. Whichever of those two stories is true, less than 10 years after the establishment of the Bahmani dynasty in the Deccan, which took place in 1347, a Hindu power had arisen in the Hoysala territory that was so formidable that Bahman Shah's trusty minister Saifuddin Khuri had to dissuade his master from attacking it. At the time of Bahman Shah's death in 1358, Bukka alone survived of Sangama's sons, and the mantle of the Hoysalas now descended on him. The capital of his kingdom became Vijayanagar, the fortress city on the rocky heights above the Tungabhadra in its unique location of hills toppled by huge scattered boulders. As mentioned in the previous episode, throughout the many invasions from the Deccan which swept the country, that great stronghold with its 7 walls proved impregnable and was not taken until 1569. Niccolo Conti, a Venetian of noble family, who travelled in India a little before 1440, gives the following impression of his visit to Vijayanagar, which he called Bezengalia. Quote, "The circumference of the city is 60 miles. Its walls are carried up to the mountains and enclose the valleys at their foot. In this city there are estimated to be 90,000 men fit to bear arms. The inhabitants of this region marry as many wives as they please, who are burned with their dead husbands. Their king is more powerful than all the other kings of India. He takes to himself 12,000 wives, of whom 4,000 follow him on foot and are employed in the kitchen. This is considered a great honor for them." End quote. The main problem Vijayanagar with its exposed position faced, practically from the onset of the reign of Bukka, was aggression from the Deccan. But Bukka soon expanded to the south too, as in 1371 Bukka got involved in a conflict with the Sultan of Madurai. An epic version of it is to be found in the Sanskrit poem Madura Vijayam, the Conquest of Madurai, by the commanding general Campana's wife Kanka Devi. She relates the misery caused by the Muslims in the sacred city. Quote, "The temples in the land have fallen into neglect, as worship in them has been stopped. The sweet odor of the sacrificial smoke and the chant of the Vedas have deserted the villages, which are now filled with the foul smell of roasted flesh and the fierce noise of the ruffian Turushkas, or the Turks. In the suburban gardens of Madurai, the beautiful coconut palms have been cut down, and on every side are seen rows of stakes from which swing strings of human skulls strung together. The Tamrapani, the river flowing through Madurai, is flowing red with the blood of the slaughtered cows. Despair is writ large on the face of the unfortunate Dravidas." That's the Tamil name for Tamils. End quote. While sojourning at Kanchipuram, she further relates, Campana dreamt that the goddess of the Pandya country described the pitiful state of that land under the Muslims, and that he gave him a sword dispatched by Agastya, that is, the sword of sovereignty over the Pandi country, or southern Tamil Nadu, which the Pandi kings were no longer capable of wielding. The army set out about the beginning of 1370 Christian era from Jinji in the South Arcot district and inflicted a crushing defeat on the forces of Madurai at Samyavaram near Srinagari. With the conquest of Madurai, the whole of South India, extending up to Rameswaram, the passing towards Ceylon, came under the sway of Vijayanagar. Bukka died 7 years later, and he was succeeded by Harihara, the first of the line to assume the royal title, the Chhatrapatihood. 2 kings, both named Devaraja, followed, and at the accession of Devaraja II, 1421 to 1448, when Conti visited it, the Vijayanagar kingdom was at the height of its prosperity during its first dynasty. Early in his reign, Devaraja got involved in a war with Firuz Shah Bahmani as a result, according to the chronicle, of the Hindu monarch's infatuation for a beautiful girl who lived in Mutkal. He had besieged her to join his harem. Her parents were overjoyed, but the girl refused to go to Vijayanagar, saying that if she went thither she would never see her parents again, and that she was too fond of them to ever let this happen. When the king heard of her refusal, the king got furious, and he readied his army to seize her by force, though Mutkal was in Bahmani territory. The war went bad for Firuz Shah Bahmani at first, but it ended in a humiliating peace to the Hindu monarch, in which he had to yield one of his daughters to the harem of the Sultan, though the Chhatrapatis of Vijayanagar, the Muslim chronicle observes, had never given any of their daughters to anyone but of their own caste, and considered it degrading to intermingle with strangers." End quote. Soon after his accession in 1436, Sultan Alauddin II sent his brother Muhammad against Vijayanagar to recover the arrears of tribute, and Devaraja had to pay a large amount, as we saw in the previous episode. The Vijayanagar armies were so consistently defeated in their contests with Bahmani forces that Devaraja finally held a council of his nobility to explore the causes of Muslim successes and ways of counteracting them. As a result, Muslims were thenceforth eligible for service in his army and allowed the free exercise of their religion. A Quran was placed before the throne in order that they, Vijayanagar chronicles say, might perform the ceremony of obeisance in his presence without sinning against their laws. Further, the Hindu soldiers were to receive better training, particularly in archery. Devaraja II was followed by Mallikarjuna, who repelled a combined attack by the Bahmani kingdom and the Gajapatris of Orissa. But the next king, his brother Virupaksha, was so hopelessly incompetent that Vijayanagar was in danger of breaking up, and its total disruption was only prevented by the initiative of powerful provincial governors. Most important among them was Saluva Narasima, ruler of Chandrakiri. Saluva Narasima saw that the only way to save the kingdom of the confusion was to put an end to the old dynasty and assume the royal title himself. He therefore commanded his general Narasanayaka to proceed against Vijayanagar and capture the city. The Portuguese historian and travel writer Pedro Nunes gives us a graphic account of the last scene. How Narasima's captain arrived at the city gates and found them undefended. How he penetrated the palace and found no one to oppose him. How he even went as far as the harem, slaying some of the women, and how at last the craven king fled. Thereupon Narasima was raised to be king in 1486. And the Portuguese later on called the kingdom Narsingal after him. By this so-called first usurpation, Narasima and his supporters surely saved the empire from falling apart. But like any usurper, Saluva Narasima found that it was easier to capture the Qadi than to keep it, to enforce his authority in the kingdom. The captains and the chiefs who lent him support in seizing the crown were unwilling to submit to him, and he had now to fight his own former supporters and friends. And all that internal fighting greatly weakened his capacity to resist his foreign enemies, so that he was defeated by the king of Orissa, Purostama Gajapatri, in 1490. He did not long survive that defeat and died in 1491. He left behind 2 young sons, who he commanded to the care of his loyal general Narasanayaka, the son of Tulawahara. Narasa at first made the elder prince Timabupa king, but Timarasa, a rival of Narasanayaka, had him murdered. The crown then descended on the younger prince, Imadi Narasima, but Narasanayaka retained all real power in his hands as a regent, and even assumed the royal title and the royal style. Friction thus naturally arose between him and the king, which increased when Imadi Narasima refused to punish Timarasa, the murder of his elder brother, as Narasanayaka wanted, but rather favoured him. The breach between them became such that Narasanayaka finally marched with his troops from Penagundi to lay siege to Vijayanagar in 1492, and as the price of peace with the regent, Imadi Narasima had to abandon Timarasa, who was punished with death. The king was removed to Penagundi, where he was kept under close surveillance. This is known as the second usurpation, and it led to new internal troubles which beset Narasanayaka throughout the 12 or 13 years he was the virtual ruler of the kingdom. Imadi Narasima continued to be kept under tutelage, though he was old enough to look after his own affairs now. He was finally assassinated early in 1505 and was shortly after succeeded by Veera Narasimha, who thus inaugurated the third or the Tuluva dynasty of the Vijayanagar kingdom. Nunez wrote that after Narasa's death, the whole land revolted under its captains, and the murder of the king and the following usurpation could not have made the position of Veera Narasimha any easier. Yusuf Adil Khan of Bijapur had long coveted the rich lands of the Krishna Tungabhadra Doab that were under Narasimha's sway. At his insistence, the Bahmani king Mahmud Shah persuaded all the assembled nobles of the various Deccan courts to join him and wage a righteous religious war rather than the common internecine fighting between the sultanates on the infidels of Vijayanagar. The first jihad, in accordance with the Compact of Bidar, as it was called, took place in 1502, the last year of the regency of Narasanayaka. The Muslim army met with little or no opposition. Mahmud Shah conquered the Doab with its two famous strongholds, Raichur and Mutkal, and handed over the conquered territory to Yusuf Adil Khan. The acquisition of the Doab whetted his appetite for more territory, and the usurpation of Veera Narasimha and the subsequent rebellion against him offered him an opportunity. Adil Khan allied with Kasapa Udaya, the governor of the important fort of Adavani in the Tungabhadra, and he laid siege to the fortress of Kandavolu, Kornool nowadays. Adil Khan, however, failed to achieve his objective. The Aravidu chief, Ramaraja I, and his son Tima, whom Veera Narasimha sent against Adil Khan, inflicted a crushing defeat on him, and as he was retreating hastily, he destroyed his forces completely and he was expelled from Vijayanagar. Out of this chaos and invasions emerged Krishna Deva Raja, son of Narasimha and the greatest king of Vijayanagar, who ascended the throne in 1509. At that time, the Kajapatris of Orissa were in occupation of the northeastern districts, and their king, Prataparudra, was openly hostile and aggressive. And though the Bahmani kingdom had split up into 5 separate states, still the Muslim pressure from the north, especially from Bijapur, continued unabated in its strength. There was also the newly arisen power of the Portuguese to contend with, a power which was rapidly establishing control over the routes and the maritime trade of the west coast and seeking profitable political contacts with the country powers. Nevertheless, within 10 short years, Krishna Deva succeeded in firmly establishing the authority of Vijayanagar all over the country. There was no thought of revolt anymore, and no great discontent anywhere within his vast realm. Chiefs in the core of the kingdom were restrained from above by royal fortresses on the Brahmin commanders that were garrisoned by troops who were drawn from 2 sources. On the one hand, foreign Portuguese and Muslim mercenary gunners, and on the other foot soldiers who were recruited from the non-peasant or forest Adivasi people who are found over much of the central peninsula of India. The king also enfranchised a new strata of lesser chiefs, totally dependent upon military service under Krishna Deva. They were the polygars, as the British called them, and the Portuguese became his closest friends. As a Portuguese mission was sent to Vijayanagar by Viceroy Alfonso de Albuquerque to conclude a commercial treaty and an alliance against the ruler of Talikota in Kerala, the Portuguese arch-enemy, shortly after Krishna's accession. Krishna's foreign policy was mainly to recover the provinces which had been lost to Orissa, and it had partly succeeded by 1516. His invasion and victorious march into Orissa until its capital Cuttack was reached had complete success. Reduced to an extremity, the Orissan king, Prataparudra, sued for peace and offered the emperor the hand of his daughter, which was accepted. 4 years later, profiting by the dissensions within the 5 kingdoms of the Deccan, Krishna Deva captured the city of Raichur Doab, which had been the cause of heavy fighting with the Deccan kingdoms for 160 years. Its fall was largely due to the assistance rendered by Portuguese musketeers with Cristóvão de Figueiredo at their head, as, thus the chronicle, with their arquebuses, they picked off the defenders right from the walls, and therefore enabled the besiegers to approach the lines of fortification and pull down the stones of which they were formed. Krishna Deva was an able general. In the course of his campaigns he temporarily even occupied Bijapur and destroyed the great fortress of Gulbarga, the original capital of the Bahmani kingdom. But in contrast to so many other successful soldiers of medieval India, he was merciful towards the vanquished too. A zealous Hindu with strong leanings towards Vaishnavism, Krishna made generous endowments to temples and Brahmins. He added new towers, gopalams, to various temples, endowed them with new land, cultivated the heads of religious communities, gave presents to priests, and enlisted their support for the struggle against Muslim rulers as well as Hindu potential rivals, so that they would be branded by the holy man as rebels in return for grants of lands. Such endowments to temples did not directly contribute to the military strength of the empire, therefore, but they did enhance the loyalty of the Brahmins and of the people in the areas where the rulers of Vijayanagar had only a precarious hold. There was another aspect of this policy of utilizing religious prestige and loyalties for the strengthening of the imperial system. The rulers appointed many Telugu Brahmins from their own homelands as commanders of fortresses in all parts of the empire. The Telugu didactic poem Amukta Malyada, said to have been composed by Krishna Deva Raja himself, commends Brahmins as provincial governors and fortress commanders, because their first loyalty would be to the king, and because they would strive to overcome the disdain of Kshatriya and Shudra officers for commanders of lower subcastes. All South India was now under Krishna Deva Raja's sway, and the many quasi-independent and semi-independent chiefs that had already existed under the Hoysalas, like those of Bankapur, Kersopa, Batkal and so on, had become his vassals. Except the core zone of the empire in modern Bellary district, most of the empire was itself divided into a number of governorships under generals or Amaranayakas, each of whom enjoyed practical independence so long as they maintained a certain quota of horses, foot soldiers and elephants, in constant readiness for action, and as long as they paid an annual contribution to the central treasury. In return, the monarch had to command the universal respect of his subjects, and he had to exhibit great energy, tact and vigilance in the performance of his public duties. Krishna Deva proved himself more than equal to that task, and there was no disorder anywhere in his realm during most of his reign. European newcomers admired the impressive organization of the empire. Domingo Paes, a Portuguese who visited Vijayanagar in 1522, wrote, quote, "This king has continually 1,000,000 fighting troops ready, in which are included 35,000 cavalry and armor. All these are in his pay, and he has these troops always together and ready to be dispatched to any quarter wherever it may be necessary. I saw, being in this city of Vijayanagar, the king dispatch a force against the place, one of those which he has by the sea coast, and he sent 50 captains with 150,000 soldiers, amongst whom were many cavalry. He has many elephants, and when the king wishes to show the strength of his power to any of his adversaries, among the 3 kings bordering on his kingdom, they say that he puts into the field 2,000,000 soldiers, in consequence of which he is the most feared king of any in these parts. Should anyone ask what revenue this king possesses, and what his treasure is that enables him to pay so many troops, since he has so many and such great lords in his kingdom, who the greater part of them have themselves revenue, I answer thus: these captains whom he has over these troops of his are the nobles of his kingdom. They are lords, and they hold the cities, the towns and the villages of the kingdom. There are captains among them who have a revenue of 1,000,000 and 1,500,000 pardaus, others 200, 300 or 500,000 pardaus, and as each one has revenue, so the king fixes for the captain the number of troops which he must maintain in foot, in horse and elephants. These troops are always ready for duty, whenever they may be called out, and wherever they may have to go. And in this way he has this 1,000,000 of fighting men always ready. Besides maintaining these troops, each captain has to make his annual payment to the king, and the king has his own salary troops, to whom he gives pay. He has 800 elephants attached to his person, and 500 horses always in his stables, and for the expenses of these horses and elephants he has devoted the revenue that he receives from the city of Vijayanagar." The linchpin of the entire imperial administration were thus clearly the Nayakas, whom Paes calls captains. In earlier Hindu kingdoms, such chiefs were largely locals, but the Amara Nayakas of the Vijayanagar Empire were named. Under the later dynasty, they were often Telugu warriors. Besides military duties, they had administrative and judicial ones too, and when central control slackened, they might convert their assignments into hereditary holdings or even become independent warlords. Some of them would eventually emerge as semi-independent kingdoms when they had sufficiently consolidated their power, even when they were still under Vijayanagar hegemony. Such was the case with the Nayakas of Ginji and Madurai in the Tamil parts of the empire, and of the Keladi Nayaks of Ikari in the Kannada lands, who had all originally distinguished themselves as military leaders against the sultanates. Pais found it difficult to guesstimate the size of the city of Vijayanagar because the hills between the various parts of the city prevented him from seeing the whole at once. So far as he could judge, it was as large as Rome. The houses were said to exceed 100,000 in number. If that guess be near the truth, the population cannot have been any less than 500,000. The numerous lakes, watercourses and orchards all evoked his admiration. Pais considered Vijayanagar to be, quote, the best provided city in the world, for the state of this city is not like that of other cities, which only fail of supplies on provisions, for in this one everything abounds. Pais was shown round a large part of the palace enclosure, which contained 34 streets. He saw one room which was, quote, all of ivory, as well as the chamber as the walls from top to bottom, and the pillars of the cross timbers at the top had roses and flowers of lotuses, all of ivory, and all well executed, so that there could not be better. It is so rich and beautiful that you would hardly find anywhere another such place. End quote. All such wonders of the palace the Muslim invaders later on would take special care to ravage. Of the Vijayanagar palace compound, in the present Hampi ruins, only a few scattered buildings remain, while the temples are rather than ruins mostly still in good condition. Nunes, another Portuguese, who wrote some 13 years later, in the reign of Achyuta Raja, mentions that all the utensils used in the royal service were of gold and silver. Some of the golden vessels were of immense size. Prostitution was widely recognized and was even encouraged as a good source of revenue for the kingdom, which deeply taxed it. The women attached to the temples, as Pais informs us, quote, are of a loose character and live in the best streets there are in the city. It is the same in all their cities. Their streets have the best rows of houses. They are very much esteemed and are classed among those honoured ones who are the mistresses of the captains. Any respectable man may go to their houses without any blame attaching thereto. These women are allowed even to enter the presence of the wives of the king, and they stay with them, and eat betel with them, a thing which no other person may do, no matter what his rank may be. Some of them eat flesh. They eat all kinds except beef and pork, and yet nevertheless they cease not to eat this betel all day. End quote. Some such women were immensely rich. One was reputed to possess 100,000 gold pieces. Towards the end of his reign, Krishna Deva's health began to deteriorate, and rebellion broke out in many parts of the kingdom, which had to be suppressed with difficulties. The semi-independence of Ikari, of Ginji and of Madurai dates from this age. He died in 1530. Neither his brother Achyuta nor his nephew Sadashiva Raja were strong rulers. For the first 7 or 8 years after his coronation, Sadashiva was the only king. But the real power was always in the chief minister's Ramaraja's hands, and in due course Ramaraja assumed all the royal prerogatives. Sadashiva was kept under close guard by his minister, although Ramaraja and his brothers Tirumala and Venkatadri went on one day every year to prostrate themselves before their lawful sovereign, and for him to confirm their prerogatives. Ramaraja destroyed many of the old nobility and raised his own family to the highest ranks. Rama Raja also began to admit large numbers of Muslims into the rank of the army, a practice that had indeed been started in a small way by Devaraja I, but now a large part of the army came to consist of them, and many of the Muslims in Tamil lands go back to these military colonies, which they founded in the Vijayanagar territory in this period. No important offices up to that time had been entrusted to them, but Rama Raja now employed Muslims in places which gave them an intimate knowledge of the internal affairs of the state. Rama Raja also used every opportunity for interfering in the relations between the Muslim states of the Deccan and for playing the 5 states off one against the other, in the hope of keeping them weak and divided and bolster Vijayanagar's strength. The Muslim rulers, needless to say, could not fail to see what was happening and what he intended, and in the end Rama Raja would pay the ultimate price for relying on the divisions among the Muslims. In 1543, Bijapur and Ahmednagar made up their differences, and they agreed that the former was to have a free hand against Vijayanagar if the latter was then free to act against Bidar. Ibrahim Adil Shah then invaded Vijayanagar, but he gained nothing, as his forces were turned back by the generalship of the Keladi chief Sadashiva Nayak. In 1548, Rama Raja aided Burhan Nizam Shah, Sultan of Ahmednagar, in the capture of the fort of Kalyani from the one in Bidar, and the fort remained in Burhan's possession till his death in 1553. His son, Husain Nizam Shah, then entered into an alliance with Ibrahim Qutub Shah of Golconda to renew the war with Bijapur, and he laid siege to Gulbarga in 1557. Ibrahim Adil Shah then called on Rama Raja for help, and he promptly responded by marching in person at the head of his army. Anxious to avoid bloodshed, Rama Raja brought about a meeting of all the parties at the junction of the Bhima and Krishna River, which resulted in a treaty of mutual alliance and protection, by which, if any of the contending parties became the victim of an unjust attack, the others were to join him against the aggressor. That was a collective security alliance, as it would now be called. The first of the contracting parties to disregard this Four Kings settlement was Husain Nizam Shah, who invaded Bijapur in 1560. Ali Adil Shah fled to Vijayanagar and begged for the assistance of Rama Raja, who responded to the appeal and also called upon Ibrahim Qutub Shah of Golconda to fulfill his part according to the treaty. He did so reluctantly, but at the approach of the combined forces, the Nizam Shah retreated into his dominions and made over the defense of Kalyani to one of his Hindu officers, Bhopal Raj. The Allied army left behind a division of its forces to invest Kalyani, and it pressed on to Ahmednagar. The Nizam Shah was beaten in a battle at Jamkhed, and the fleeing Sultan was pursued up to Daulatabad. After this, Rama Raja invaded Bidar and inflicted a severe defeat on its Barid Shah Sultan, who had his country devastated and the principal forts captured by the enemy. He had to sign a treaty in which he was thenceforth to take part in Rama Raja's wars against his enemies. The Muslim rulers now perceived clearly that their quarrels only profited Rama Raja. Ibrahim Qutub Shah and Husain Nizam Shah, who had suffered the most from Vijayanagar incursions, therefore took the lead in the formation of a confederacy against Vijayanagar. Besides that, Vijayanagar's arrogance had become insufferable to them. The Muslim chronicles also affirm that, quote, "the Hindus committed great outrages, and omitted no mark of disrespect to the religion of the faithful, singing and performing their abominations and their superstitious worship in the very mosques. And on his return the officers and soldiers of the army treated the Muslims with disrespect, using contemptuous words for them." End quote. The Barid-Shahi kings, who had first invited the intervention of Vijayanagar in the affairs of the Muslim kingdoms, could plead their own weakness and that they were in the neighbourhood of comparatively powerful states, whose Shiite rulers they, as Sunnis, regarded as heretics, as excuse why they had besieged Vijayanagar's aid. But the kings of Ahmadnagar and Bijapur, who followed their example, had no such excuses. The arrogance of Rama Raja had humiliated and disgusted his allies as much as his enemies, and he now demanded the cession of extensive tracts of territory from Bijapur as the price of his assistance to Ali Adil Shah, and from Golconda as the penalty for Ibrahim's duplicity and hostility. Such a situation could not be tolerated any longer. Embassies passed to and fro among the various sultans. Differences were finally made up, a marriage between the daughter of the Adil Shah and the Nizam Shah was arranged, and steps were taken to form a general league of the faithful against the Hindu monarch. The combined armies of Ahmadnagar, Bijapur and Golconda marched out in 1564. The strength of the combined Muslim force, which numbered about 100,000 men, lay in their infinitely better training and discipline, in the efficiency of their cavalry, and their mounted archers in particular, and in the overwhelming superiority of their 600 pieces of artillery that were commanded by the able and experienced Chalabi Rumi Khan, who had seen service with the Ottoman Empire in Europe. Rama commanded the Hindu army in person. His strength lay in numbers. He had under him 82,000 cavalry, 900,000 infantry, 2,000 elephants and some artillery. The core of his army were his well-trained Telugu warriors, but most of the rest of his host were badly trained peasant levies of the provincial Nayakas, most of them only armed with pikes and cutlasses. The Muslims reached Talikota, a small fortress town in the neighbourhood of the Krishna River, on 26 December 1564, where they put up their headquarters and where Ali Adil Shah lavishly entertained the two other sultans. Meanwhile there appear to have been attempts of the three to reach some settlement with Vijayanagar. But, says the chronicle, Rama Raja, although he saw the formidable combination of the Muslims against him, did not dissent in the least from his former haughtiness, but treated the Muslim ambassadors with scorn, regarding their enmity as of little moment. End quote. The rival armies stood facing one another across the Krishna River for over a month, as the Hindus had strongly guarded and fortified all the forts across the river. When everything was ready, and Muslim scouts had found a little guarded passage, the main body of the Muslim army crossed the Krishna by night by a feint which drew off the Hindu forces guarding the fort, and they proceeded to attack the Hindu camp in the morning. Rama Raja, though completely surprised, was able to organize his defense. In the engagement that followed in the afternoon, Tuesday, 23 January 1565, Ramaraja and his two brothers all took part. In spite of his advanced age, Ramaraja had insisted on directing operations from a litter. He held command of the centre, and he was opposed by Husain Nizam Shah. His left, under his brother Tirumala, was opposed by the Bijapur force under Ali, and his right, under Venkatadri, opposed the sultans of Ahmadnagar, of Bidar and of Golconda. The tactics of both sides were simple. Chalabi Khan had disposed his guns in 3 lines according to their caliber, and covered them with 2,000 mercenary archers who had orders to fall back when the enemies approached. The Hindus opened a preliminary fire with matchlocks and rockets, and then they advanced in dense columns of infantry upon the guns. They were repulsed, but a second mass of troops came on again, and Chalabi Khan met this second attack by loading his heavy pieces with bags of copper coins, which in the Deccan were lumps of metal and were comparable in effect to European shrapnel. The effect of those salvos at point-blank range was devastating, and the Bijapur cavalry, supported by elephants, now charged the shattered and confused columns of infantry through the gaps they had left between the guns. As the Hindus fell back, Ramaraja was taken prisoner and instantly beheaded, and at the sight of their leader's head on a Muslim pike, the huge army began to flee. If the chronicles can be believed, above 100,000 were slain in this battle and in the pursuit that followed it, which, if this figure is right, makes Talikota one of the bloodiest battles in history so far, and the bloodiest in Indian history. For there was total confusion amongst the Vijayanagar forces, which were decentered forces where everybody only obeyed commands of his familiar Nayaka, and those forces had become confused and mixed up, while the elephants of their commanders were dead or invisible to the troopers, and in that confusion, while the Vijayanagar forces still far outnumbered their opponents' forces, no attempts were made to rally the troops or to take up fresh positions. No new forces could be raised to defend Vijayanagar. The road to the great city lay open. First to enter it were the dejected soldiers and princes from the field, bringing the bad news. Then Prince Tirumala entered and fled with all the treasures of the empire, loaded on 1,550 elephants. He thus left the city and its 500,000 inhabitants to their fate, taking with him only the captive Emperor Sadashiva and the women of the royal family. The approaching victorious army was preceded by hordes of robbers and by Adivasis from the hills, who fell upon the helpless people and looted their houses and shops. Then the Muslim armies came, with fire and sword, with crowbars and axes, and they carried on day after day their work of destruction. Seldom in history, not even during the contemporary infamous sack of Rome in 1526, had such havoc been wrought so thoroughly and wrought so suddenly on so splendid a city, teeming with so wealthy and so industrious a population, in the full plenitude of prosperity one day, and the next seized, pillaged, and reduced to ruins. All this amid scenes of savage massacres and horrors that beggar description. Unlike Rome or Delhi from the sack of Timur, Vijayanagar would never recover from the blow, and was gradually forsaken by its population, dwindling to no more than the village of Hampi. Tirumala now took up his abode in Penagundi in southern Karnataka, and began rebuilding his army by all possible means. In his dire need, he is even said to have taken several horses from Portuguese merchants and refused to pay for them later. He gave up Vijayanagar partly because opinion in that city favoured the claims of Ramaraja's son, Peda Tirumala alias Tima, for the regency. 6 years of anarchy and confusion intervened before Tirumala actually became king. The effective independence of the Nayakas of Madurai, Tanjore and Jinji can be traced to this period, so that the empire had now lost factual control over much of Tamil Nadu, while still claiming to be the overlord there. Yet Tirumala somehow still managed to hold the rest of the empire together. He tacitly condoned the new independence of the Nayakas of the south, and he made them his friends, rather than trying to recover those outlying territories. Within his core territory, the Vodayar dynasty of Mysore and the Nayaks of Vellore and Keladi still owned allegiance to him as before. He set up each of his 3 sons as viceroy over a linguistic area for general control and supervision. Sriranga, the eldest, over the Telugu area, with Penagundi as his capital. Rama, his second son, over the Kannada country, to rule from Srirangapatnam, the later capital of Tipu Sultan, and Venkatapati, the youngest, to rule over the Tamil country from Chandragiri. He assumed the title Reviver of the decadent Karnataka Empire and had himself crowned as Chhatrapati in 1570. Sriranga began to rule in 1572, though his father continued to live in retirement for 6 years longer. He carried on the work of restoration, but there were many obstacles in his way. In addition, his 2 Muslim neighbors, the Adil Shah and the Qutub Shah, continued their invasions, resulting in much loss of territory. When Sriranga died childless, his younger brother Vengata succeeded him. He celebrated his coronation in 1585, and his reign of 28 years was marked by a modest revival of the strength and prosperity of the empire. He had dealt successfully with the perennial troubles with the Deccan sultanates, controlled the internal disorders effectively, and had promoted the economic revival of the country. Although Venkata II had several wives, he had no son. His love for one of his wives made him wink at the trick she had practiced on him by borrowing a lady from one of her maids and calling him her own. Hoping to stop the mischief from going any further, Venkata nominated Sriranga to the succession, but the presence of his putative son was a complication, and Sriranga was no paragon of strength or wisdom either. The nobles fell apart in 2 camps. The son's party, which was headed by Kuburi Jaka Raja, the brother of Venkata's favourite queen, and Sriranga, supported by Velu Kuti Yachama Nayaka. Jaka Raja seized and threw Sriranga and all the members of his family into prison, and he crowned the putative son as emperor. Velu Yachama made several unsuccessful efforts to rescue the emperor and his family. Sriranga and his whole family were finally murdered as the only certain way of preventing all future intrigues for their rescue and claims for the restoration of their rule. This massacre of the royal family sent a shock of horror through the kingdom, and Yakaraja and his partisans came to be deeply hated. Sympathy grew for Rama Deva, the sole survivor of the family. He owed his survival to the forethought of Yayachama, who now proclaimed him emperor, and there ensued a prolonged civil war in which the whole empire took part. The decisive engagement between the two parties took place at Topur village in 1616. Yagaraja fell in the battle with many of his lieutenants. His army broke up and fled, and Yachama's victory was complete. But this was not the end of the war. It was pursued by Etiraja, Yagaraja's younger brother. The death of the putative son of Vengati in 1619 put a final end to the war, and Rama was now finally recognized in Karnataka. But that civil war had given Bijapur its golden opportunity. The Sultan could now at last realize his ambition of capturing the western Telugu country. In 1619 he sent Abdul Wahab Khan against Kurnool. Abdul Wahab Khan was defeated and forced to make peace. But this was only a truce. For in 1624 he came back and attacked Kurnool a second time. The Bijapur forces won the battle that followed, and Rama was too preoccupied to intervene. With his death in 1630, at the early age of 28, Kurnool passed to Bijapur for good. With no son or brother, Rama had nominated his cousin, Peda Venkata, a grandson of the great Ramaraja, to succeed him to the throne. But Timaraja, a paternal uncle of Rama, thought he had a better claim, and he seized the government, compelling Venkata III to remain at his native place of Anagundi. Ginji, Tanjore and Madurai declared for Venkata, and Tima got no support and was generally looked upon as an usurper. For reasons that are not clear, Sri Ranga, once so loyal to his uncle, now turned against him and actually asked for 2 invasions from Bijapur in 1638 and 1641. On the first occasion, the Sultan's forces invested Bangalore, and Venkata had to seek for peace by paying a huge indemnity. The invasion of 1641 was led by Randullah Khan, who was joined by Sri Ranga. They jointly marched on Vellore and pitched their camp within 12 miles of the new capital of Vijayanagar. Aid from the Nayaks saved Vellore for a while. Watching the course of events in the West Karnataka, the Sultan of Golconda now in turn sent an army from the east to the coast in April 1642 to capture as much territory as possible from the Hindu Empire. Venkata III fled into the jungle of the Chittoor district, where he perished on 10 October 1641. When he learned that Venkata lay dying, Sri Ranga deserted the Bijapur general and proclaimed himself defender of his ancestral kingdom and king on the 29th of October 1642. But he could not undo the mischief that had already been done, and many of the Nayakas, like Krishnapa Nayaka of Ginji, were against him. For a time, however, jealousy among the Muslim states appeared to give Sri Ranga a chance, and the aid of Bijapur in January 1644 enabled him to check the advance of Golconda beyond Udaykiri for a time. But then the southern Nayaks, with Tirumala Nayak of Madurai at their head, rebelled, and they appealed to Bijapur, which sent Mustafa Khan against Vellore, and Sri Ranga, who had gone south to meet the Nayakas' forces, had to hurry back to the defense of his capital. Golconda also struck at the same time in the direction of Vinukunda and Udayakiri. Utterly overwhelmed and helpless, Sri Ranga made a last appeal to rally the Nayakas to protect the temples, the Brahmins and the religion. But they were deaf to such appeals, and the great Mughal permitted Bijapur and Golconda to attack and partition the Karnataka between themselves. Defeated in battle by his own feudatory Nayakas in December 1645, Sri Ranga fell back on Vellore. Pressure from Bijapur diminished for a time, as the commanders went to Bijapur to settle disputes that had arisen among themselves. But Golconda was still active, and the Qutub Shah's commander-in-chief, the legendary General Mir Jumla, on whom I shall have more to say in episode 22, occupied parts of Nellore and Kudapa. Mustafa Khan of Bijapur now came back too, and he prepared to attack Vellore. The Nayakas realized too late the danger that was threatening them altogether, and even so Tirumala Nayaka of Madurai stood aloof. All other resources being spent, the jewels of the women of Vellore and the treasures of the Tirupati temple had been used to maintain the last defending forces. Another big battle followed at Virinchipuram, 4 April 1646, in which Sri Ranga was defeated and General Mustafa Khan besieged Vellore. Meanwhile, Mir Jumla took all the territory in the east, up to the Dutch settlement of Talikota. Sri Ranga finally had to abandon all resistance and seek refuge in Tanjore. Madurai and Mysore were unable to ward off the Muslim conquest of the Karnataka, which was completed by 1652. When Tanjore, like Ginji a little before, submitted to Bijapur in 1649, Sri Ranga fled to Mysore, where he kept up a Vatham existence, trying to keep up the semblance of a court in exile at the Keladi's chief's household, dreaming of the reconquest of Vellore until death came as a relief to him, sometime round 1672. Thus ended the Karnataka Vijayanagar Empire more than 3 centuries after its foundation. During that long period it had fought a constant struggle against its Muslim neighbours on the north, it had destroyed the gruesome tyranny at Madurai, and it had kept southern India free from the inroads of Islam. True, we find Hindus in the service of Muslim rulers and Muslim troops engaged by the Hindu emperors of Vijayanagar. Diplomatic and even dynastic alliances also occurred often enough between these two continuously contending parties. But they do not fundamentally alter the historic role of Vijayanagar, which was to preserve South India as the sanctuary of the traditional culture and institutions of India. The great commentary of the Vedas, composed by a syndicate of scholars with Sayana at their head, and the new towers raised in important temples of the south, which follow the example of the Kopuram towers erected a millennium before that, and that were joined to temples the core structures of which might have been built 500 years before, are the eternal inheritance of the great Vijayanagar Empire. However, we have in this episode not dealt with all of the south. For one important area, Kerala, the lands of the Perumals, did at times pay tribute to Vijayanagar, but was never part of it.